everyone. Really nice to hear you all in the chat. So I can see a few familiar names, which is lovely. I'm really pleased that you've all been able to join us this morning. And I know everyone always says this, but I mean this very genuinely in what is a very busy work life. Yeah, we'd like to welcome you to the webinar today, Early Childhood Education, Changing the Lives of Children Affected by Trauma, brought to you by the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare and presented by the Alana and Madeline Foundation. So before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we're all joining you today from Aboriginal land. I'm lucky enough to be joining you from Dja Dja Wurrung country, and I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. We want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I introduce our lovely presenters for today, I do just want to quickly cover off on some housekeeping. So there will be some time for questions at the end of the session. So please use that Q&A box to ask any questions along the way. You can use the chat function as well, but sometimes it gets lost. So if you can use the Q&A, that would be easier. If you're having any technical issues, firstly try exiting and rejoining, and if not, we'll monitor the chat as well and we can support you if there's anything we can do to get your audio working, if that's the problem. And just a reminder that today's session is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides at the end, along with some other key resources covering details on the kindergarten subsidies, including Early Start Kindergarten, the childcare subsidy and the additional childcare subsidy to support you in your work. All right, now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our presenters for today, Rachael, Silverman and Kathy Warwick from the Alana and Madeline Foundation's Trauma Consultancy Program. Rachael and Kathy have extensive experience working in child and family services, supporting children living in out-of-home care and who have experiences of trauma, promoting the safety, stability and development of vulnerable children. Rachael and Kathy now work in the early years, supporting educators in working with children and families with trauma backgrounds and presentations. And it's my pleasure to hand over to them now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet, and welcome everybody. Even though Rachael and I can't see you all, it's actually really lovely to know that you're there. I wanted to add Rachael and my voice to the acknowledgement of land, and Rachael and I are meeting you all from the lands of the Wathaurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we'd actually like to really acknowledge the ancient living culture where thousands of years of caring for children have meant that they've been raised to be safe, to be strong and to be connected. In terms of who we are, and I'm not going to talk too much about this because there's a lot we want to get into in terms of this presentation, but one of the most important parts that we bring into this space with you today is a real appreciation and understanding for the incredible work that you do in the family services sector. So we know that this work is incredibly rewarding, but we also know it's really challenging. And we know over the last couple of years, those challenges have increased immensely. Many of you will know about the Alana and Madeline Foundation. For those of you that don't, the foundation's origins sit inside the story of the tragedy of Port Arthur in 1996, where Alana and Madeline and their mother Nanette and 35 other people were killed. So the story of our foundation starts with significant tragedy, but out of it has emerged an organisation with a real commitment and desire to protect and keep children safe from violence and from harm. Our TRACS program and the work that Rachael and I do is really an extension of that. So we work really hard with vulnerable families and vulnerable children inside the early years space. In kinders predominantly, we are doing some work in primary schools and we do work in broader childcare settings. But our trauma-informed lens really brings an opportunity for us to advocate for the voice of really vulnerable children. And this is probably the crossroads of the work that you do and what we're trying to do in terms of really giving a voice to these children in the early years sector. So we're motivated and excited about what's possible, which is really what's driving our aims and our agenda for today. We only have a small bit of time. Rachel and I would happily talk about this work for ages, and I'm, we're going to be really, really specific about what we want you to take away. So the key aims that we're driving today are really around looking at the benefits of early years and kinder, being able to really think about the role that you can play in terms of supporting vulnerable families' access into services, thinking about the benefits in terms of, why it's so important in the early years space. But we also want to spend a bit of time thinking about the challenges, because we know with all of the benefits in the world, there's also really significant challenges in bringing people into a space where they can access support. And we want to consider the role of early years services as part of a web that's woven around a vulnerable family's entire life. So what is imperative about the early years? And I guess, for many of you working in the family services space, there's a lot of conversation in the sector around the importance of early childhood. And it's important because children are born really dependent on their adult relationships to ensure that they are able to be physically and emotionally safe. And we know that that's what helps them to be able to thrive. Children are born and they're hardwired for connection. And their brains are developing in those first 3 years at the fastest rate. So there's no other time or no other period developmentally where the brain is growing as rapidly as it does in those first 3 years. So that tells us that the quality of those interactions, the quality of those relationships are directly influential on a child's capacity to be able to build healthy, stable, safe experiences and to reach their potential. We also know that children benefit from access to healthy and responsive and attuned relationships, and that's within a range of environments. So we know those relationships are important, but the expansive opportunity to create relationships and experience relationships in a range of environments is actually equally important. What actually impacts on that is when we start to talk about the experiences of vulnerability. So we know the brain grows really, really rapidly. We know children rely, they're incredibly dependent on caregiving relationships to keep them safe. They benefit from being able to be connected in all relationships and opportunities in a range of environments. But we know that when they experience vulnerability and trauma, that this can have a significantly adverse effect on their physical, emotional, and cognitive development. So early childhood experiences of trauma and vulnerability can be really long-lasting, and lifelong impacts can really, really affect their capacity to grow into healthy, thriving adults. So what are the types of things when we talk about vulnerability and trauma? And these are some statistics that have come from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and they by no means are indicative of all of the things that you're working with. So we know that these only reflect a small portion of the adverse and traumatic events and experiences that can impact on children and families. What's interesting though with these statistics, and I think that there's a couple in here that really resonate, certainly in the work that we do, but also when we're thinking about the early years sector. So in 2019, or the year between 2019 and 2020, over 121,000 reports were made to child protection across Australia. I'm suspecting, and I think there's early indications from Child Protection Head Office, that actually the last 12 months there's been an increase on these numbers, which is not really surprising when we think about the increased pressures and anxiety and stress that COVID has had an impact for families. But in that 12 months, infants and children under 4 years of age represented the majority of substantiated reports. So there were a lot of reports of concern and worry to child protection in terms of immediate safety and wellbeing, and the majority of reports that were made that went on to be substantiated occurred in the under 4 age range, which is really, really quite significant. So we know that that those worries about the impact on adversity on younger children is really confirmed by what it means for those experiences to include really significant risk. We know that 1 in 5 children were developmentally vulnerable in one or more domain in 2018. And we know that domestic and family violence is the leading cause of homelessness for children in Australia. Now, like I said, these statistics probably don't even touch on a range of other adverse experiences and vulnerabilities that impact on the families that you work with every day. But what we want to highlight is that when we talk about trauma and we talk about vulnerability, we're not just talking about, kind of risk and harm at the child protection end. We also need to be thinking about the impact of chronic neglect. We need to think about grief and loss. We need to think about poverty, parental mental illness, and experiences of physical and emotional distress and harm, financial struggles and financial difficulties. So we know in the work that family services do, you're often working with complex trauma, and you're actually often juggling more than one issue at a time. And we also know that there's a coexistence between these factors and that they can impact and overlap. And so you're often trying to unpack with families a multitude of really complex issues at any point in time. But actually, when we start to think about the range of vulnerability that these statistics start to help us think about, what comes up is a question about what does that look like for the child. So if we think about these statistics in terms of, if we know that families are being impacted by family violence at increasingly high rates, we know that parental mental illness, depression and anxiety are exceptionally high. We know that there's intergenerational trauma. We know that families are experiencing a host of really, really challenging times at the moment. And as professionals, you're wading into that reality every day in the work that you do. But what does it mean for the child? What do we see in the child in terms of how they are managing?
So when we think about the impacts of vulnerability and trauma, the things that we're likely to see and the behaviours we'll often hear about or witness ourselves in the family home, and things that you'll see on the right in that list there, you might see poor relationships. And this can look like lots of different things. It can include being really indiscriminate with strangers, as well as being very reserved or standoffish. You might be seeing an increased need for control in play or in their environment, and difficulty regulating emotions, particularly some really strong emotions like frustration or anger. You might also see issues with internal systems like digestion, toileting, even eating. And all of these things more tell us that there's been a disruption to predictability and security for young children that they need in their attachment figures. And often what's really going on underneath is what's happening on the left in that iceberg image. A child wants to know, am I safe? Am I loved? Am I seen? And this is where we know it gets really tricky, because it's exactly what is happening for the parents and the adults that we work with too. Yeah. This is just part of the complexity that you're navigating as family services practitioners, and is also what our early year services are managing as well when they have families enter their kindergartens, their health nurse centres or playgroups and things like that. They often see the behaviours within the children as well. And it's something you'll find similarities and overlap between the things that you might see in the family home and what the educators might be seeing in a child or a kindergarten setting.
We do a lot of work, don't we, Rachel, in talking about that iceberg, because that iceberg is such a wonderful way of getting the adults around children to understand how their experiences are shaping their behaviour and how their behaviour is being communicated.
Absolutely. And that underlying need of, actually, am I valued? Am I seen and heard in this relationship?
Yeah. And we know when children have really healthy relationships, those things underneath the iceberg, those experiences of safety and predictability, they organically grow. It's when there's those really adverse vulnerabilities and challenges that children then start to feel unsure about the world being safe, about adults being able to keep them safe, about whether they're valued.
And that's when you see those behaviours popping up everywhere, like an iceberg popping up out of the water.
Absolutely. So when we kind of recognise the importance of the early years as a developmental, it's a really critical stage for children's development. And when we start to understand the range of adverse experiences and challenges that families and children are experiencing in the home that are compromising those opportunities for real potential, we start to really think then about, well, what's available for families and where can, what are the additional alternatives and opportunities for children and for families to access the type of support that can really get children and families back on track. Now, family services and the work you do is one part of that. But for children, like I was saying a bit earlier, we know that their capacity to engage in safe, secure relationships and additional environments is another really key, valuable space. So the benefits of accessing early years services is really significant when we think about vulnerable and at-risk children. It does a couple of things. There's a couple of things available by accessing these services, and it allows for families to know that children can go into an environment that's going to really be focusing on their developmental needs, because early years services are really focused on child development. But while children are able to access early years services, families are actually able to do some resetting. They're actually able to start to focus on some of the needs that might be impacting on their vulnerability. Accessing services allows for role modelling. I think sometimes we underestimate the wonderful opportunity for families who don't, who themselves may not have experienced secure, connected relationships. That when they go into these environments, there's opportunities for other professionals and families to role model connection and relationship in really, really meaningful ways. We know it encourages learning and development through play. So the early years space is wonderful at recognising that children's communication about themselves and their development occurs through access to play. It builds opportunities for support for families. And so the early years space also looks at the developmental needs of children. So if there are language or speech or behavioural kind of, and I say behaviour from the perspective of, what their experiences are demonstrating in terms of how they're behaving, the types of support that can really help them grow can occur through accessing these services. It increases a child's sense of social connection. So they start to see relationships and experience relationships. It encourages children to learn and to experience routine and predictability. And the notion of school readiness, which is at the core of the work that Rachael and I do, is really about building emotional capacity alongside kind of cognitive learning. So helping children start to prepare for what becomes a really significant journey in education. It allows for professionals to collaborate. And I really don't want to underestimate the significant value of this, is that when we talk about kind of connectedness, we're not just talking about the child and the family, we're talking about all of us. That as professionals, being able to collaborate with other professionals in the support of families can be really, really, really valuable. It allows for the profession to learn from each other. So the early years sector has a real focus on child development and play. And so there's so much that can be gained. I mean, I certainly know in this role, there's a lot I've learnt about the early years sector that has really enhanced my profession. Absolutely. It also increases it's the benefit, isn't it, Rach? It also increases the trust that families can gain in being able to see professionals working together and actually feeling a sense of connection. I think the most critical part of the benefit is that it builds a web. And I think I just touched on this, but that web, it's a bit like we used to talk about children being raised in a village. And I think this notion of a kind of supportive web is something that we need to be aspiring, not just for the children that we work with and the families, but for ourselves, ways in which we can be connected to other professions and be able to support families really holistically. Okay, but we know, as wonderful as that is and as exciting as all of those opportunities are, we also know there are barriers. And often it's the barriers to being able to reach a place of support that can be really, really difficult. So while I'm going to hand over to Rachael to start to unpack some of the barriers to why vulnerable children and families can find getting into early years services really challenging, I want you all to think a little bit about the families that you're working with. I want you to think about what sounds familiar. I want you to think a bit about what makes sense in the role that you play and what types of things could be helpful to your work.
Thanks, Kath. So we are going to touch on just a couple of myths or barriers or worries that the families might have. And our first one is really that kindergarten is too expensive and hard to access. So for the families you're working with, we know that often there's a hesitation around enrolling into a childcare or kinder program. And sometimes you might hear families say they can't afford it, they have nowhere to get the child there, or just that the sheer idea of filling in all the paperwork and providing the documentation is overwhelming, both for the families, but also for us as professionals too. I don't know about any of you, but I find forms confusing at the best of times. And we know that our kinder programs and our early years services often have a lot of paperwork. They have a lot of documentation that goes along with them, and it can be confusing for everyone involved. Not to mention, we know that your role as practitioners is also very paperwork and admin heavy at times. So it can feel really overwhelming on both parties. Luckily, we also know that there are lots of avenues for support for families and professionals. And I know Harriet's going to be putting some resources into the chat here for you all, but also sending out some info sheets about options for subsidies and support. And I'm also aware that the centre offers a newsletter that can include some tips and support for enrolling vulnerable children in kindergarten as well. So there are...
Sorry, Rach, I was going to say sometimes too, when we know the benefit of why we're filling that form, if we can really appreciate kind of what's possible at the other end of it, sometimes that value can make a difference in that slog. Because I'm with you, I think sometimes these forms can feel really overwhelming.
They can, and you're so worried that you're going to get it wrong that sometimes it feels easier not to do it. Or, you know, for some of you, you might be really familiar with accessing the early years through your own experiences of children or previous workplaces. But for some of us, we never have experience with that, and it might be really unfamiliar for us. So this will be a really new venture, regardless of if you've had your own personal experiences or not. It's important to recognise that these systems that we're part of are really complex sometimes, and it can feel hard or unfamiliar initially, and particularly for our families.
And the early years sector, they get it too, don't they, Rachel? Like the educators and the teachers that we work with understand that kind of sometimes it's really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so they're really, really open. They're really open to be part of the types of conversations that can move these processes more smoothly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think just acknowledging that actually it might be really hard initially is a good starting point. And look, we know that this is by no means an exhaustive list of what we might hear or see or think and how we might support these families. As practitioners, you're going to know what strengths the individual families that you're working with each have. One of the key things that we thought about is those really practical elements of getting a child to kinder, but also the recognition that there's another professional on the other end of that journey for you to connect with in the educators within the kinder space. And these educators are going to be a really strong support for both the family and for you. We know that it can be a really tricky space to enter into, just understanding all of it. So there are lots of opportunities for support and tips and things like that out there. So I think it's a really great place just to start with families and go, you know what, this is hard and we understand. Our second kind of myth for the day is that early years educators are just babysitters. And, you know, I think there's a bit of a history here that kinder and childcare was just another source of caregiving, really. And there wasn't much else to it. They kind of just watched them. So not only might families feel some resistance to putting their child into this space, but even as professionals, we also might come with our own bias or belief about this. And there's a recognition that these early years educators are often understaffed and under-resourced, much like family services practitioners, much like child protection workers. Lots of us, right, in this field, and all of the systems that we work in are often under-resourced. And what we wanted to bring to focus today was the acknowledgement that despite any of those historical things around supervision and babysitting, the early years sectors have actually had really tremendous growth. The people working in this space are overseen by national quality standards that talk to approved learning frameworks, which, you know, Kath touched on before, this real notion that development occurs through play. We know that play increases brain development by about threefold, right? The national quality standards talk to ratios, qualifications that are required for these educators. And there's a lot of work being done around recognition that these people are teachers, they're educators, and to really cement that they're professionals like you and I. This works really well for you as family services practitioners because, again, it can not only support you to support the families you're working with, but it can create that opportunity for you as a professional to come together and work with families as a collaborative effort. Clearly, I haven't had enough coffee today. We'll work on that. As a professional, they offer information and access to a different lens, as Kath mentioned before, and a different type of knowledge that can add value not only to your family's world, but to your professional world as well. And it also gives the families you're working with a really nice opportunity to see how building relationships can be done. They can watch you engage with another professional and another adult and see that role modeling happening in front of them. There's a myth that the services will know all of my information. And, you know, you might see or hear some really tough stuff from our families, that people have misused their information before. They've had professionals that haven't treated them with the respect that they need and deserve. Often these vulnerable families have felt a reduction in their privacy anyway, particularly if child protection's involved. They feel like they have limited autonomy and that lots of things get sort of forced upon them. And one of the biggest recognitions in this myth is being able to explain to families that the early years educators working with us are also bound by professional ethics and conduct requirements. It's an opportunity for really transparent conversations with our families, that there will be some information that needs to be shared so that educators can ensure your child's safety and can appropriately support them within the kinder space. However, the family can be part of deciding what information is shared and what isn't. And as part of that existing network, you can support and drive some of this conversation around, what do you think the bits are that you would find hard to share with the kinder? Is that something I could share with them when we meet them together? Yeah.
It is, Rachel, it's the real shared space, I think, that the early years sector and you know, kinders and educators are bound in exactly the same way as you, to be able to, you know, see the duty of care around children being safe. So they grapple as well at times with having concerns and worries and knowing what to do with those. Absolutely. So being able to have really transparent conversations is really critical. It's what scaffolds your professional practice, and it's actually the same type of dilemmas and practice kind of challenges that they work with too. 100%,
Kath. And, you know, it's really important. I think all of us need some level of control in who gets to hear our story, and allowing families to be in control of that information and that story and be supported to share those hard bits can actually encourage the trust within your relationship and also encourage building trust in other relationships, because, you know, these early years spaces are actually a really good place to test out some of that safety that can be a bit of a struggle for our families. Yeah.
Your point on there too about kind of fear and shame, I'm just looking at the, you know, it's a bit like that iceberg, right? So we were talking about the iceberg in terms of children, but for the parents that we're working with and that you're working with, there's an iceberg there too. So for them, what might sit underneath their fear and their worry, you know, is shame and uncertainty and trust or lack of trust. So we're working to that, aren't we?
That initial kind of resistance that can kind of come when you're sitting with a family and they're like, I'm not doing that. There is no way I'm putting my child in that position. It can actually come from a place of fear and shame. Yeah. And it's important to recognize that we all have our own icebergs that are kind of bobbing up in that water every now and then. Yeah. So this is a really big one. Early years educators will judge us. We know that our families often feel like they're under the microscope. Family services is involved, child protection is involved, other services are in and out. You might hear things like, this is just another person judging me for being a bad parent. Yeah, I'm just doing it wrong. And this is really beautiful thing that happened yesterday for me at a service that's just kind of coming into my mind now around an educator who was explaining to me they had a new child start that day. The parent had come in to enroll them the day before. And they said they couldn't start the child until the last week of term 1 because they didn't have the money to buy a bag and a lunchbox before then. And they didn't think they'd be able to send their child. So the educator actually went, hang on a second, and went and got some things. They got a bag, they got a lunchbox, they provided them with a drink bottle, all of the things that they would need to send their child to kinder. And the child showed up the next day. And I think it's this beautiful thing that shows this willingness that earlier years educators have to support the families in their communities and in their kinder spaces.
They're a resource in their own right, aren't they?
They really are. They really are. It's such a nice opportunity for families to feel that immediate support from them of going, oh, you're not against me, you're on the same page, you want this for me as well.
And it's okay, because what matters is my child joining and being part of things.
Absolutely, and building on that community. Yeah. Often we know that educators are part of the community that they're working in, you know, so these conversations, if you can have them, are a really beautiful opportunity to increase those feelings of safety and trust within a relationship with another professional. And it's also a really great opportunity, again, to role model that type of holding that you're wanting them to be able to do with their children, to know that it's okay to talk about hard stuff, that it's okay to feel like you're being judged, and that not having the emotion is what's being judged, like that it's okay to have those feelings about everything.
And the other part of it too is that it's not about it all being perfect.
No.
About the type of opportunity that when there is maybe a judgmental comment or there is something that happens, being able to support a family in being able to repair, being able to understand that all relationships and all experiences can get stuck sometimes, can have their own obstacles. And when we're supporting families inside services and with educators, and you're supporting families, there's a shared opportunity for them to actually experience what it's like when things go wrong, that we can come out of it the other end.
Absolutely. That rupture and repair, that notion that all healthy relationships will have times where things don't go well and there's a rupture. And how do we come back and repair that together? Yeah. And look, I think this is one of the biggest things I've heard families say when they engage with other professionals, that they're going to judge me, they're going to tell me I'm a bad parent, that I'm not doing enough. And it kind of allows us to think back about that iceberg and remember that we all have these icebergs, that it's not only the children in our world that are experiencing these feelings, the adults are too. They have exactly the same need to feel safe and loved and seen. Yeah.
And it's also really relevant too, isn't it, because we work in kinders and services right across the state. So in some of those regional areas where the communities are really small, that kind of visibility of people's vulnerability can be quite challenging. So we're really mindful that, you know, there are kinder teachers and educators who are naturally as the same as there are with family support workers and family services practitioners living in the same community.
Absolutely.
And so the exposure of vulnerability is an additional, you know, which is why that transparency, that ability to kind of acknowledge the reality of the environment everybody's in, and being really clear about how we can support families to be able to, you know, access and have their needs supported in a way that isn't judgmental is really, really important.
It is. And I think about the kinders that I'm currently working with that are often in lower socioeconomic areas or in more regional areas. They have conversations regularly with me about, you know, we don't want to make our parents feel like they're not doing enough. So we just have extra fruit here. We just have extra snacks here so that we can top things up if kids need, because we don't want to shame parents into thinking they're not doing enough. You know, it's beautiful when you can see it happening.
And it's often, I mean, one of the things I've experienced a lot in the last couple of years in this role have been often in those regional areas, but in most services, when they see children coming into the room, that they may or may not know the backstory. So one of the things that's really, really significant from the early years space is they may not know what's sitting behind what's happening for these children. When they start to become worried or concerned, they're often grappling to try to work out who's out there that we can connect to.
Absolutely.
So there's a desire to kind of not so much judge, but to be able to recognise I'm seeing vulnerability and I actually want the best for this family.
And continue to connect and continue to build on that web for themselves as well. Yeah. So how do we work together? So we often talk about these 3 E's, the engage, enroll, and engage again. And this kind of speaks to that as a family services practitioner, you'll initially engage with the family and have these conversations about the worries they might have about accessing early years services. You'll work together, do some capacity building and set goals. And from there, you can actually start to engage them and help them enroll the entire family, the whole family, into the service. You're not only offering them an opportunity to focus on child protection concerns when you do this, or their own mental health or anything else that might be happening, but you're also offering them the start of another connection and another web that they're becoming part of. It's also important to remember that you're a key component in connecting with that service, that by you stepping into that service with them, you're creating and role modeling exactly what you want to see within that family. It supports them, and it can also support us as professionals to create those connections. And we often talk about and love seeing that during initial transition visits, the family is supported by a family services practitioner, that there is another person there who can help regulate the adult, who can help regulate their child at that point. Yeah. When we enroll the entire family, it allows us an entire connection into a different lens and a different network, really, that helps us work as a team. The next part is also really critical, though. We engage again. We need to stay engaged. We need, as family services practitioners, for you to maintain that engagement with the family and the early years service. And you really serve a critical role in helping to kind of connect and transfer some of that information between the early years service, or the EYS on that slide there, and the families. When sometimes we know that they might get overwhelmed, they might shut down in stressful situations, they might have really poor memory or concentration in stressful situations like heading into a kinder for the first time. So you can actually act as a conduit between all of them in an ongoing way to ensure that there's a strong connection and there's capacity for that rupture and repair to occur. Not only does this allow you to work together well and can reduce the overall sole responsibility for you as this family services practitioner, but it also means you can take the routines and the positive habits and the responsive boundaries that can occur within a kinder space, and you can help translate that into the family home. This is going to promote a whole lot of stability and security for the child, and it will encourage families to try new things in their own environments and in a way that works for them. This is then obviously going to have a flow-on effect to potentially a reduction in the likelihood of a re-entry into the system later on. And, you know, we tossed up the idea of making this kind of graphic into a bit of a circle situation, because it really is an ongoing piece of work that keeps happening, like a rupture and repair. You keep enrolling, you engage again, you engage, you enroll.
Like circles, Rachel, that could be it. We like circles. It's because we like circles.
We do also very much like circles, yes. So we could chat forever about circles. So the power of relationships is really one of the most critical things, yeah. And what we know about relationships is when there's vulnerability and experiences of trauma, they often occur inside of a relationship. But what we also know is that our greatest healing also happens inside of relationships too. Every single one of us that's here today, all of our work is about relationships. And we want to strengthen and build out the relationships for our families to create those really strong webs for them. We know that our needs don't just go away as we get older. And we know that the more connected, safe relationships that all of us have access to, the more people we have that can meet our needs, then the more opportunities we have to heal and recover from experiences of vulnerability and trauma. And it's one of the key components for us in the benefits of accessing those early years services, and particularly kindergartens and childcare settings, is that you can continue to create that web.
So what are the kind of take home? And there's a lot that we've talked about, and it's wonderful, Rach, to kind of really unpack and think about what some of those barriers and obstacles can actually look and feel like. And they're not always easy solutions, but there's some thinking that can be done around how we can leverage, or how you can leverage the way you work with families to kind of, to role model and build relationships, to to kind of access the types of supports that early years services can provide. So we know relationships are crucial to all of the work, and I'm just completely reiterating what Rachael just said, which is probably why, relationship and repetition are really, really critical.
Absolutely.
And there I am back to my circles.
The circles, yep.
So they are crucial. They're crucial to all of our work, and they're the greatest vehicle for improving outcomes. So I'm sure each of you can think about those families that you've worked with before, or are working with now, where the relationship that you're building, you can see and you can feel inside the experience of your work, how that leverages changing thinking and opportunities for the types of shifts that can make a real difference to the lives of people who are, who've experienced lack of safety in relationship. So we know for children, it's even more critical that the more quality, healthy, predictable relationships that are around them, the greater outcomes they're likely to have. So when we add the early years services into your work with families, when we start to think a little bit, as Rachel was saying, about expanding that web, primarily for the child, because we know developmentally it's important, but that ripple effect of what that expansion of practice can look like for families as well. It also means that you're not sitting as the sole person responsible for the whole experience of this family. And I think it's really, really critical that when we think about a village for a child, we're thinking about a professional network that allows you to be able to kind of share concerns and worries, develop skills, be able to, to be able to access other professional support, advice and information. So the early years sector have so much breadth and depth of knowledge and interest and curiosity and practice wisdom that actually can enhance your work too. Like I said, I think I've gained immensely from learning from my fellow colleagues in the early years space over the last couple of years. So families who experience vulnerability need this even more. And they need us as professionals to support them when they're trying stuff they're not sure about, when they're resistant. I know we talk about the word resistant. I'm pretty sure that that's a familiar term, a familiar experience for all of you, that actually being in partnership actually helps that type of scary, challenging newness to kind of become something more meaningful. We know that every child and family deserves a web. So actually this is, what we talk about here. We're talking about vulnerable children, but actually every child and every family deserves to experience a sense of connectedness. The engage, enroll, engage again is a really, really lovely way of thinking about how we stay in the momentum of relationship, how we stay in the momentum of practice. And sometimes it can be really challenging in your work, because if you're managing and dealing with really significant risk, there's really significant family violence, really significant physical, emotional harm, the types of impacting factors that can overwhelm a family and also overwhelm us as practitioners. It can be really hard to see the simplicity of childcare or the simplicity of kinder or early years services as a priority. But actually, when we're able to find those little connections, it allows the space and time to be able to see the whole family's needs and start to unpack some of those deeper needs that are happening for families. While running parallel, we can stay connected to what can be achieved through early years services to really, really grow and develop children.
Yeah, and I think, Kath, on that, this notion of a web can work really well in the sense that we know, and there's a lot of research to support that, informal connections are what make the biggest difference for families. Early years services can act as more of an informal connection in lots of ways for them. So it can actually increase their capacity and their strengths that they've already got and the resources that they already have.
So true. And we've got, I'm thinking of lots of examples, even just across this first term in the early years space of in our role in supporting educators, being able to really scaffold and advocate for them in care meetings, care plan meetings, in professional meetings. So we're working really hard in our space to really promote the enrol the whole family perspective. So encouraging and supporting and advocating with educators around how do we bring out all of these professions into a space where we're going to be able to benefit by providing the type of professional support that can really make a difference.
Absolutely. 100% agree, Kath. And I think, as we've said, you and I could talk for a very long time about all of these things and would thoroughly enjoy ourselves. We have come to the end of the formal presentation. I think Harriet's got a couple of questions there. So I'm just going to end that screen share so that we can actually have a chat.
Nice. Thank you so much. I feel really warmed at the phrase that every child deserves and needs a web. I think that's a really good take-home message for everyone here in the audience today. I think that sort of goes to the heart of what we're talking about. And like you said, there are all these barriers, but if we keep that in the centre of the why, it sort of gives us all motivation, doesn't it, to work with the families to kind of get over those hurdles together.
Yes.
And I work really hard, Harriet, not to think of spider webs, but that's my but I think the other part to that too is I think that what lays underneath it is recognising need. So we work a lot professionally to identify the needs of children and the needs of families. Yeah. But this notion of a web is this bigger picture about the range of needs that even as professionals we have. You know, so that notion of being connected is beneficial to everybody.
Yeah,
it's the how we do it. Sometimes we can be so busy, it can feel incredibly exhausting to think about how on earth do I add that to the list of things I'm already trying to do.
Exactly.
And we've had so much discussion in the chat today. It's been so lovely. Everyone's been so engaged. We do have a couple of questions though, which I would like to answer before we finish off. So one of the questions was around the myth, a parent or carer believing that their child is too young to attend a service, especially in the context of a child who has experienced trauma and maybe is presenting with a developmental delay. How would you sort of approach this with a parent or carer and a service?
It's a really, really good question. I mean, I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is when we talk about need, what we're actually able to do is look at children individually and kind of recognise that for all children, they reach milestones, and the notion of being really prepared and ready for kinder or for accessing early childhood can be different from child to child. So how those conversations start between a support system, a parent and a service is really, really key. A lot of it's about the transition. So there's a huge amount of work that the early years space does in understanding where this child is at. So it kind of goes back a bit to when Rachael was talking about what information needs to be shared and talking to a parent about what your worry is that Johnny might not be feeling, or that we feel that he's experienced things that have meant he doesn't look or feel like he's ready. So what's the need underneath that? The need is to be able to build some adult connection and peer connection. So if we start to talk about what the experiences have been for a child and we understand therefore what the needs are, there's an entire discussion that the early years services love having, which is how do we marry that up with what we know will be beneficial? Yes. So we know that trauma happens. We know that there are a multitude of children in every single service that we go into that have experienced significant trauma. The vulnerability, and I know that you all know this, but we're seeing a level of vulnerability inside the early years space like never before, because I think that's true of where everybody's at the moment. So all of these discussions about if I'm worried and I'm concerned, how do I translate that into an individual plan where a child and a parent's worry can be heard, and then a plan, like it might mean a delayed start, it might mean coming for a couple of hours, it might mean that the educator and the parent stays for a small period of time. I know COVID put the kibosh on a whole heap of those types of things, and hopefully we're coming out the other end. But I think a very large part of what we're trying to present in this presentation is there's so much room inside the professional relationships to really hear a parent's worry and do some planning.
And you're right, Kath, there's a lot of individuality that comes in the early years. I think about all of the services that I'm working with this year, they all do something slightly different for every child that's in that room and every family. I've got some services that a couple of the kids, you know, still require parents to stay for an extended period. They do extra transition days. They encourage you to stay if your child needs you and those sorts of things. But they also have a really beautiful way of individualizing every child's need in that space and recognizing actually this is where the focus is for this child.
Yeah. And what will work for one child might not work for the other.
No, that's right.
But the desire to be able to really target it's really important.
Yeah.
And I think that goes for children when we're talking about early start kinder. We're talking about children who are 3 years old when they're accessing the early start kinder grant. And for those who aren't familiar with that funding, there'll be a resource sheet that will come at the end of today for that. But sometimes what happens is because those children are 3 years old, they do end up in rooms with their 4-year-old peers because there's not 15 hours available for them in a 3-year-old room. So I think that what we're talking about here applies in that context too. They may actually be a year younger, it may be true, but the same strategies apply in terms of the power of relationships, sharing your fears, sharing a child's strengths, adapting an individualized approach, what's going to work for that child and that family. It's about the relationship, isn't it?
It is. And I think, sorry, you go, Kath.
Well, I was going to say just quickly that the other thing too, which I really learned, was the danger of the assumptions that we make in that knowing, right? And so for me, spending a lot of time inside kinder rooms and really recognizing the kind of range of access to kind of play and activities actually means that there's lots of room for children to play at the level that they're at. So it isn't just about this expectation that we're squeezing children, which I think was always my worry about early, when we talk about early start kinder, for example, we've got to match developmentally the needs of children. And the early years sector is working really hard to kind of recognise I can't be expecting from the 3-year-old what I'm necessarily aiming to kind of achieve with the 4-year-olds getting ready to head into school. There's a lot of room and the kinder space really demonstrates that.
And I was going to say something similar, Kath. I think that danger of not actually knowing is we make assumptions about what our child's capable of and ready for. And I think of the kids that are entering 3-year-old kinder now, COVID has been most of their life. Even my little nephew kind of flinches when a child comes near him on the playground because he hasn't experienced that for so many years of his life. But the opportunity within that to then understand where that child's at, where the gaps might be, and what they actually need and what they actually excel at already.
There are kinder rooms. I mean, I've been in some rooms recently where they've actually had in their PlayStations a kind of a place for kind of masks, and so children have room to play out their realities. Which is it's wonderful to think about the potential, particularly when educators are equipped with as much information as they need to really meet the needs of the children coming in.
Absolutely, yeah.
And one of the other questions that we've had through the chat, people have asked the same question differently, but when we're working with, it might be foster carers, kinship carers, or parents themselves who have themselves had a negative experience of kindergarten, or they've maybe tried to engage with other services previously and it's for whatever reason it's not gone well, what are some of the key things that we can sort of do to support that carer or parent? Because that's a very real fear and that's a very real experience and we don't want to disregard that.
Absolutely. Honestly, part of it is just acknowledging and recognizing that would have been awful and that experience wasn't okay. I think part of it for me when I hear that from carers and from parents and from adults who look after children is that recognition that, look, we can't give a guarantee that it's going to be different, but why don't we try it together? Why don't I come with you and I support you and your child and we just see? And if it doesn't feel right, then we take it back a step and we find a way that does work. There is nothing worse, even as an adult, than feeling like you're being forced into something that you don't want to do. Yeah. And again, COVID has shown more and more my need for control in particular areas of my life. But I think for everyone, we all have areas that we need a bit of extra control. So let's own that and go, okay, how do we do it in a way that's going to support you and work?
Yeah. And validating alongside being able to kind of have someone advocate. So when someone can advocate for somebody's fear, not just acknowledge it, which is really critical. So I can kind of hear that experience is shaping how you're seeing this opportunity. So let's work out what parts of that experience went wrong so that we can, so that we can not just learn from that, but we can, or it can be advocated for in a different way.
Yes.
I think transparency, and it's tricky, right? It's really tricky when people's vulnerability is, because sometimes that fear can come as anger. Sometimes that fear comes as a type of resistance that can be really hard as a professional to navigate. So being able to hold people's fear as a professional is a really hard part of it. But actually, when we were talking before about that role modeling, when even if it's a foster carer or a kinship carer, as much as a family member, when they can experience that we can be in that space and walk with them through that, it's really, really powerful. And I'm sure lots of you know that.
Lovely. All right, that's a really nice kind of note to end on. And I just want to say thank you so much to the two of you. You have sparked such rich discussions in the chat, and I can really see that the content that you've shared with us today has really genuinely resonated with the audience. So I'm so pleased that you were able to spend this morning with us, audience. And then Kathy and Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. We do have a survey for today, and we would really love if everyone could fill that out as part of today's session. The feedback is really, really helpful for us. We schedule a few of these throughout the year as part of the centre's work, and we'd love to hear if today was helpful for you and what else you'd like to hear from in the future. So that's part of the survey that I've just put in the chat, and we will also send that out as part of the session today. There'll be recordings of the conversation, some slides, and also the resources about the Early Start Kinder childcare subsidy and additional childcare subsidy. There was also some great conversation in the chat about the Access to Early Learning program.
Yes.
So I'll include that as part of the resources too, because we didn't really touch on a lot of those subsidies and supports today. However, we do have the newsletter, which I mentioned, which has a lot of sort of broken down practical information about the kind of nitty gritty service stuff, which sometimes can be difficult to translate with what's available on the department's website. So I'll again put that in the chat. If people want to subscribe, they can. And I think that is it for us today. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your days.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.